a call of heritage. Scrape back the thin veneer of modernity. Grasp and raise again that which has lain so long in dust. From the tales you tell and the songs you sing, to the very food that feeds you. Join us now in finding folklore. Once upon a time, there lived a lad named Jack. Now Jack was good and Jack was fine, but Jack was foolish and Jack was lazy. Jack was a shammocking man, and we all know what that means. One fine day, on one fine May, many and many a year ago, our shammocking Jack was walking along the river with his sweetheart, when what should she see by the banks but the most beautiful blue flowers, with the sweetest yellow speckles, and with a squeal of delight she ran down to pick some, and who can blame her? It wasn't for her to know the grass was wet. It wasn't for her to know the current was strong. It wasn't for her to know her shoes would slip. Down, down towards the water she fell, and down, down into the too cold river, and down, down she was dragged, and far away. And with her last breath she called out to her Jack, "Forget me not. Forget me not." Now this startled Jack, so it did, for Jack had not prepared himself that day for blue flowers and wet banks and forget-me-nots called out from damsels in distress. So Jack ran home to tell his mother, and to see what thoughts and wisdom she'd have to share on the subject. And just as he was passing by a large, grassy mound, what should he hear but someone calling his name? "Jack!" he heard, and Jack again. But sure enough, he stopped and he waited and he looked about, and for the life of him there was not a soul to be seen. So off he went to go once more, when what should he hear but again, "Jack! Jack!" And again he stopped and he waited and he looked about, but again not a soul to be seen. So off he goes to go once more, when once more he hears his "Jack! Jack!" So he calls back, What?" to the nobody he can see, but the nobody calls back, "Tell Tiddy Cole that Grand Colin is dead." Now Jack had not prepared himself that day for grassy mounds and for Jack Jacks and for tell Tiddy Cole that Grand Colin is dead. So Jack bolted then back to his mother's without a by-year leave, and he didn't stop for blue flowers and he didn't stop for grassy mounds, he didn't even stop for his own true name. And when he was home, he sat himself down by the hearth and he told his mother all. And when he'd finished telling his tale, and he crowed out in his best impression of nobody telling somebody, "Tell Tiddy Cole that Grand Colin is dead," what should happen but that, from out the hearth, there leapt a tiny, wrinkled, worsted, pale-faced, bustle-headed little man, who bellowed out, "Then I am the king of the Pixies!" And he leapt up the chimney and was away like lightning. "Who is that?" sputtered Jack. "Tiddy Cole, I should reckon," came his mother's reply. "Perhaps he can get your sweetheart back." "My sweetheart!" cried Jack. "I'd almost forgot!" And he bolted away from the hearth, and he bolted away from his mother, and he bolted back out the door to see if he could see a Tiddy Cole coming out the chimney. Sure enough, there was the Tiddy Snool flying out the top like fire and dancing through the air like who knows what. And Jack was after it like nobody's business, and he chased it on, and he chased it off, and he chased it up and down, until finally it settled, and took to ground in a little meadow, not far from the village. So young Jack crept up there to that meadow, and there he saw the Pixie coronation. And all was light and wonder and dancing and music, and there he saw his sweetheart, crowned and silent, gorse about her mouth, a ring around her neck. And Jack leapt up and he called out, and all turned round, and just like that, all were gone, and Jack alone, and the meadow bare. Now Jack ran this way, and Jack ran that, and Jack ran every which way but loose, loustering out for his sweetheart, and calling for the Pixies as he did. But just as he'd catch a glimpse of their lights and give chase, with a pop and a whistle and a silence they disappeared. And there they were again, but further off this time, and on he runs, and gone again, and again, and again, and again, and before you know it, Jack's up to his knees in bog, with not a notion of where he was, or how he got there, or how to get out of it, and not a light to be seen. "Help!" he called. "Help! Help!" And would you know it, but there in front of him, where there had been none seconds before, a ragged colt now stood, walking an inch above the starky bog, chewing some gorse and watching poor Jack's glutching. "Help!" called Jack. The colt watched and the colt chewed. Jack sighed. "Help!" Again and again and again, until finally the pony wandered near enough that Jack could grab at his neck and drag himself out with a pop and a whistle and a sigh of relief, and about time too, as he gripped tight to the rough fur about the pony's neck. But it was then that Jack noticed something strange. And as he pressed and he kicked with his feet, he realized they weren't touching the ground. And as he looked at the bog, he realized he was high above it. And as he checked the coarse fur, he found it blacker than he remembered, and coarser too, for that matter. And where once there'd been the body of a pony, there was now a great towering bear. And where once had been a pony's head, there was nothing but void and bloody stump. And Jack was hurled from the beast, whose mouthless shriek filled the air and mixed with his own. And just as Jack was preparing to meet his maker, with a pop and a whistle, there was nothing there at all. For a moment, Jack just gaped. "Ah!" he cried, and he leapt 3 feet from the ground, both hands clutching an unusually sore buttock. "Ah!" he cried again, as he leapt 3 feet more, his hands at his belly as it pinched. "Ah!" for a third time, and another 3 feet, and this time the back of his head. So Jack didn't wait around for a fourth, and he turned tail and he ran from his invisible ruxing, and he ran so fast and he ran so quick that he ran headfirst into a tree, before wheeling round, tripping over a rock, and landing himself in a gorse bush. As Jack eked himself out, scratched up something silly with oohs and ahs aplenty, all about him there came a great echoing laughter that bounced about and away. "Ho, ho, 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 ho!" And Jack felt fear once more. And so he tore himself from out of that bush, and so he ran as fast as then he could, and so he ran then for as long as he could, until he'd found his way back to his mother's, and back to the hearth, and he told her all and awaited her wisdom. "Stop quirking about with colts, Jack. You should ask yourself a witch." "But ask her what?" "Why, how you can get your sweetheart back, of course." "My sweetheart!" cried Jack. "I'd almost forgot." And Jack bolted from the hearth and bolted from his mother and bolted back out the door. And he ran and he ran and he ran till he found a frisky little witch, small and wrinkled as a new-hatched bird, with 7 teeth, 3 warts, and 1 big eye. And he told her the whole story. And he begged and he pleaded and he pretty pleased for help, for he needed the finest witch in the forest, and only the best would do. "Then 'tis I you'll be needing indeed," said she, "for I don't care what that big squab over the way says. 'Tis I who's the finest witch, and 'tis I who'll show her too. Jack boy!" "Yes, little witch?" "I shall help thee, but thou must help me." "Anything, little witch, anything." "There be a huge, great, bloated squab of a witch over yonder, not too far from I, and she be my rival, and she be my foe. I needs you to take her this here special brew, and you must give it to her, and you must tell her 'tis the source of all my power. Then you must return to me, Jack lad, when all is said and done, and I shall help thee find thy sweetheart wheresoe'er she be." So off Jack went, until he found a huge, great, bloated squab of a witch, grunting and scrunting like an ancient saddleback pig, with 7 chins, 3 teeth, and a single hair on the single wart that stood at the end of her single nose. Now Jack told her the whole story, of his missing sweetheart, and his forget-me-nots, and his tell-tiddy-cole that Gran Colin is dead's. And he begged and he pleaded and he pretty pleased for help, for he needed the finest witch in the forest, and only the very best would do. "Then 'tis I you'll be needing indeed," said she, "and I don't care what that flisky wee snool says, for 'tis I who's the finest witch, and I'll say it again, and I'll show her too." "Do you mean that little witch, what lives over yonder, not far from here? Why, she told me such things of you. Terrible bad they were, and she told me that she was the finest witch in all the forest, and she told me that this very thing here is the source of all her power." And with that, Jack revealed the witch's brew. "No, did she indeed? Well-itty, well-itty, well, Jack. For as it so happens, I will help thee, if thou shalt help me first. So give I that brew for myself, Jack, and take ye this one back to her instead, and trick her to the drinking of it. Then return you to me, Jack lad, and I shall give thee an ointment for thy eyes, to help thee find thy sweetheart." So off Jack went over yonder, not too far, till he found there again that little wee witch. And as he went on his way, that great big witch what he'd left cackled and laughed away to herself as she built a cage to catch him in. And she cackled and laughed as she lay in wait for his unsuspecting return. And she cackled and she laughed as she guzzled down the little witch's brew without breathing. And before she could cackle, and before she could laugh, with a pop and a whistle she turned into a hill. Now back over yonder, but not too far, when Jack found that little witch and told her what he'd done, it was her turn to cackle and her turn to laugh. And all at once as she did so, another cage popped up around him, and Jack found that he was trapped. "Foolish little witch," Jack bellowed, fast as you like, "for I have here the source of all that great witch's power, and I will drink this here brew of hers, and I will become more powerful than any lock. I will become more powerful than any iron bar that you can show me, and when I have escaped, a great and powerful foe you shall have in me." "The source of all her power," that little witch exclaimed, her one great eye fixed on the bottle in his hand. "Well now, Jack lad, don't let's be batchy. Why, you've passed my test. That brew will do no good to thee, for 'tis a witch's brew for witches alone, but I would like it very much indeed. Give that there to I, and I shall gladly trade with thee a magic ointment of my own, which rubbed in the eye will let thee see the very folk, and so shall help thee track thy sweetheart down." "Let me out this cage and we can talk," said Jack, and so she did. "Fetch the fairy ointment and we can talk," said Jack, and so she did. "Toss it here and we can talk," said Jack, and she tossed the ointment to him, and he tossed the brew to her, and they both caught theirs together, and Jack gave a triumphant laugh, and the little witch gave a triumphal cackle, and she shouted out, "Fool! Back to cage you go!" And the little witch popped the cork off the brew, and she guzzled it down without breathing, and with a pop and a whistle, she turned into a hill. The little witch and the great witch are still there today, and a fine pair of hills they do make, and if you didn't know better, you wouldn't tell them apart. But, back in the story, Jack took a fingerful of the precious ointment, and he smeared it into his left eye, and he blinked a few times, and he went outside. And once the burning had stopped and the tears had died, Jack saw ragged little folk were everywhere. He could not look but to see a pixie, some running, some walking, some fighting, some dancing, but each and every one making their gradual way in the same direction. So Jack, casual-like, pretended all was still invisible to him, that he was merely strolling that route anyhow, and, without raising suspicions, Jack followed them in this nonchalant manner, and before too long he saw, just atop a nearby hill, who may or may not have once been a witch, the lights and the hustle and the bustle and the noise of a not too far off market. Jack headed off towards it, and the nearer he got, the brighter the lights, and the closer he came, the hustlier the bustle. And the quicker he arrived, the stranger the noises became, and when he got to the market he saw such things as you'd need magic ointment to see, and even then you wouldn't believe it. Now all the while he was wandering, amazed around the market, Jack was having the devil of a time pretending just to be wandering aimless around a great and empty hill. But he managed it somehow, and before too long he caught sight of that very tiddy cove that he sought, striding around the market with a great crown and great hue and great ceremony, buying fine silks from fine silkworms, and fairy food for fairy feasts, and buckets of bouquets of otherworldly flowers. Now Jack kept half a sinister eye on that there tiddy cole, and when he and his retinue had finished, they started to march away, with lots of waving and lots of saluting and lots of cheering from the gathered crowds, and Jack kept keeping an eye until they were a little way off, and when they were a little way off, he started to wander in their direction, still pretending for all the world that he was blind and deaf to all about him. And in this way did our Jack start to stalk that new-crowned king of the Pixies. By and by, they all of them came to a strange barrow in the earth, with a great cleft stone that opened up before them. When Tiddy Cole and all his court had each gone through the spine stone in turn, Jack darted out before it all closed up and threw himself after them, with his eyes shut tight. And when he opened them up, all around he saw feasting and carousing, quaffing and doffing, swinging and binging, and all around he saw celebration. Every pixie there was found in his finery, and table upon table was laid with the finest and the strangest of foods. And when he heard the music, he yearned for it, and when he smelled the meat, he belonged to it, and when he saw the wine, he was lost to it. He grabbed up a goblet of the dark nectar, and it looked and it smelled and it sounded better than any drink that he had ever drunk. And just as he raised it to his waiting lips, just as it was lifted to his desperate tongue, just as it befriended that bone-dry throat, it was then that he noticed the pretty blue flowers that decorated the tables with their little yellow dabblings. And he remembered seeing them somewhere before, and he remembered the crashing current of the river, and he remembered the wetness of the banks, and he remembered the slipping and the falling and the forget-me-nots, and "My sweetheart!" cried Jack. "I almost forgot!" And Jack looked about till he found his sweetheart, bound and gagged with gorse in her mouth and a ring round her head. And he grabbed her a good hold, and he shut his eyes tight. And the fairies, they turned her into all sorts of strange and terrible things. But throughout it all, our Jack kept his hold tight and his grasp firm and his eyes closed. Until finally, they turned her into a burning hot coal. And Jack let out a scream at the heat in his hand. And he jumped with her into a well to cool off. And the fairies shot their arrows, and he felt the pain shoot through. But just as he did, he hit the water of the well. And with a hiss like a whistle, out he popped, all of a sudden, back at Ragged Boy's Hill, far from the land of fairy, and out popped his sweetheart too, well worth a whistle and naked as the day she was born. And surrounding him were big men on bigger horses, and all looking at Jack and his lass. "This is a fine quarry. What's here then?" And the man who spoke trotted forward on his steed to the front of the hunting party. And indeed it was the King of all England. And Jack told him all, and when he had told his tale, all filled with grand Collins and tiddy coals and witches both great and little, the king cried out, "Fantastic! Unbelievable! The nonsense these country lads talk!" But it was then that Jack noticed his left hand was still gripped firm, and still was curled about something hard, and when he opened it up, he saw that there was the fairy goblet. And he did give it as a gift to that king, who then believed his tale, and who gave him a good meal and good human wine, and who blessed him and his sweetheart too, who was clothed and warmed by the fire, and given 100 gifts befitting her, and a handful that weren't. When finally they went on their way, there were wide smiles and deep pockets all round. Now Jack was filled with excitement and bubbling over with glee as they made their way back to his mother's. And why shouldn't he be? He'd tricked the Pixies, he'd tricked the witches, he'd won his sweetheart back and befriended the king. Not a bad night's work at all. In his glee, Jack waved an excited hello to every stranger he saw, and an even more excited goodbye to every one that passed, until one especially short, pale, bustle-headed stranger looked askance at him, and asked with a sharp tone, "Which eye do you see me with, Bosh?" "Why, the left one." And the pixie put his left eye out with a stick, and promptly disappeared. And it never did grow back, though Jack was the 7th son of a 7th son and could perform cures, and though he bathed it in the waters of a magic spring just by the edge of the bog. He never did see the Pixies with it again, did our Jack, but he did marry his sweetheart, and he did return home to his mother, and they did all live sprack and happy ever after, shammocking no more. And you can't say fairer than that.
That was Sprack Jack. We'll be back to talk about it after the Fairies.
Come follow, follow me, ye fairy elves that be, light dripping o'er the green. Come follow Mab, your queen, hand in hand we'll dance around, for this place is fairy ground. Sometime a colt to be, rough ragged for to see. Sometime a headless bear, sometime to disappear. Then to pinch at arms and thighs, none us hears and none us spies. When once I was at rest, there snoring in my nest, unheard and unespied, through keyholes ye did glide. over tables, stools and shelves, entrapped in the fairy elves. Upstairs to nimbly creep, found me in sluttish sleep. Grace said we danced a while, and did the time beguile. In my eyes did ointment fold, that I could see them to make bold. Then o'er a mushroom's head our tablecloth we spread, to unctuous cockles stewed, makes meat that's easily chewed. Pearly drops of dew we drink in acorn cups filled to the brink. Crowned then upon the grass, I nimbly round did pass, o'er pixies on the green, their young and tender queen. Deep beneath the hill and tree, fairy elves, come follow me.
That was The Fairies, performed by Belinda Kempster and Fran Foote. And before that, you heard the story Sprack Jack, performed by Brice Stratford. And Brice is with me now. Hello, Brice.
Yes, I am. You've caught me.
There you are.
Here I am. And James is here with me now.
Hello.
Welcome, dear listeners, to Finding Folklore Episode 2. Presumably you've all listened to and loved Episode 1, The Red King and the White Ship. But if you haven't, you've got that to look forward to. And as a brief introduction to the whole structure of the show, we begin with a good performance, folklore, oral storytelling piece of a folk tale.
And it is awfully good.
I hope you. Why, thank you, James.
And then we move on
to
a piece of specially commissioned folk music, which is associated with the same folklore.
Yeah, it's when it's the recording and the performance is commissioned, but it's a traditional piece of music. In this instance, we had the magnificent Belinda Kempster and Fran Foote. God, that was
Lovely,
really good.
Lovely harmonies.
Really beautiful stuff. Their approach is so specifically folky, this lovely, as unaccompanied as possible, and really, as they term it, no frills, just focused on the music.
Yeah, we're hoping to have them back on a later episode.
Fingers crossed. And then, yes, after the music, we then move into this chatty, meandering bit where we essentially we discuss a lot of the themes and the topics that have come up in the story.
Yeah,
and,
we'll touch on a few key features of the story, some things that you might be interested in, and it's more of an overview here. And if you really want to get into depth, then we have also a YouTube channel. We've just recently released our first episode of the video, which goes into real depth about episode 1.
So yeah, each episode of the podcast will have an accompanying deep dive video just for the incredibly, the gloriously beautiful dull people like ourselves who are happy to spend 2.5 hours just in a room without anybody else listening.
And we'll have an episode about Sprack Jack coming out in about a week's time.
Generally, about a week after the podcast is released, the video will go up.
Then if you're interested in what we've been talking about in these, we'd love to hear back from you. You can find us on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, all of these places, and we would love to hear what your thoughts are on it and the way that we're trying to construct this podcast, what we're trying to do with this.
I mean, this is very much a flexible project at the moment in which we're really trying to engage with listeners, with the folk as well. And in fact, not just responses to the show itself we'd like, but also if you've got folklore you'd like to share, please
Absolutely.
do.
Yeah.
If you've seen ghosts, if you have a weird cursed item that you picked up from an antique store with a strange elderly proprietor who looked suspiciously like Peter Cushing, tell us. We want to hear.
I mean, we've already had a comment or two with that sort of thing. We heard from someone who had experienced a black dog bit of folklore, which is really, that's cool. Thank you for that comment, by the way.
And in fact, this really chimes in with the episode we've just done with the Sprack Jack story. So this story features in my book on the subject, New Forest Myths and Folklore by Brice Stratford.
It's a very good book.
Please do buy a copy. Everyone says it's a very good book. I got the story for that from extensive research and explicitly field work in terms of finding stories and fairy tales from people. I took the approach I took locally in terms of looking for whatever fragments I could find was to prioritize the elderly. The older, the better.
Yeah. So this is a specifically New Forest tale as well, as episode 1 was. Red King and the White Ship was New Forest based, but this one also features a lot of New Forest specifics.
Yes. Yeah. This is a New Forest story, just as the first one is. It's less rooted here in a sense because it's not historical, or I mean, maybe it is historical fact, but if it is historical fact, it's less explicitly historical fact.
But so when you were researching this, were you particularly trying to find New Forest residents who knew this kind of fairy tale?
Well, I was looking for old people. Yeah. I was just looking for very old people whose parents and grandparents on both sides were from the New Forest. That was my initial thing. Started with people who were over 100, then people who were over 90, then people who were over 80, and then people who were over 70. I didn't go much younger than that. And I mean, I made a point of really, really, really working with them over a period to allow them to reach back, a long time and reach back over 90 years in some instances to find stories which they may not have thought of since then. And I then sort of pulled together the different fragments and pieces that we had, and I saw what's repeated.
When you were doing this, were you searching for whatever stories they knew, and just Sprack Jack was one that popped up in a few different places?
Sprack Jack was so. You might have noticed there's quite a picaresque feel to it. It's quite episodic in some respects. So this is very common when it comes to fairy tales. And what this is, the version that we've got here, is a composite story. It's a number of different stories placed together.
Well, yeah, I did. I felt like listening to this, I felt like it really is kind of a showcase of all these different classic fairy tale features.
It's like a best of. It's like a clip show in a way. It's all the best bits together. And that sounds like it's false somehow. But it certainly isn't. I collected these in composite form themselves, as well as in singular form, as well as in episodic form.
The people who you were talking to, they had them. It was
absolutely.
It almost felt like a mashup.
It isn't that weird. It's the presumption is that when things are done in a composite way, that is somehow false, and that's something that overly fiddly collectors are forcing. And sometimes that's true, but it doesn't take a genius to just say, "Oh, well, here's a story about a guy named Jack, and here's a story about a guy named Jack. Maybe this story then goes into that story." That's normal. That is a normal aspect of folk culture and of folk storytelling, and that's certainly something that in all the people I spoke to came across. Obviously, speaking to lovely oldies was its own reward. But realizing that this Sprack Jack story was there for the taking was amazing. So far as I'm aware, this particular story, that this little New Forest fairy tale, has not been collected before. It's not been written down. I've captured it really from the oral tradition. Now, that's not to say that it's entirely unique or sui generis. There's a lot of these elements, a lot of these motifs are classics. There's something called the Arne Thompson Folktale Index, I think, and the Thompson Folktale Motif Index, I believe, and they work in tandem. And essentially, the Motif Index is really the most useful element here for me. The Motif Index is a way of categorizing these recurrent motifs and themes, tropes, almost elements and symbols that you see pop up in fairy tales and folk tales across Europe.
I've heard about this.
Oh, it's really cool. It's really, really, really cool stuff. And you realize it's a way of essentially describing a folk tale with just a few words, letters and numbers. And that sounds like a bad thing.
that specific.
That specific, yeah.
Where it's like, there are certain letters and numbers that refer to a wolf.
Exactly, exactly.
Waylaying you on the way home.
Or a bear that becomes king or something. Yeah, it's really, really cool. Funnily enough, the Great Witch and Little Witch thing, that's actually one of the most unique things to this story. That's quite obscure.
So that roots it to the geographical location, doesn't it?
Very much makes it. So for anyone who doesn't know, and I can't imagine who wouldn't know, but there are 2 hills in the New Forest, one of which is called Great Witch, one of which is called Little Witch, and they are named as such on the oldest maps from the 18th century. Weirdly spelt with a Y. I don't know why that would be.
Is that not a thing that is generally an alternative spelling historically?
Well, I think that witch hazel or witch elm might in early writings be. I mean, 18th century, to be fair, spelling was not standardized.
I feel maybe witch elm still is spelled like that.
Yeah, I think it is. Yes, who put Bella in the witch elm is a Y. Listeners, look into that phrase. Find out what it's about. I won't tell you. Google it.
I'll have to look that one up myself.
Yeah, it's really horrible. It's really horrible.
But these witches, the Great Witch and the Little Witch.
And Little, yeah. Now that's fun because the witches also reflect the 2 fairies, Gran Colin and Tiddy Cole.
Yeah, one of whom is big.
Massive, one tiny. These witches are uniquely New Forest, these 2 things.
Which I believe you reflected in the way you performed them.
In the beautiful dialect.
It's so appealing.
That was my untutored attempt at replicating a proper old mid-19th century New Forest dialect accent. There's a old pamphlet from around that time called, I forget the exact name, but it's essentially a phonetic description of and a little research into the dialect and accent of New Foresters, specifically those found in Burley, the village of Burley that now is spuriously famous for witchcraft. We'll go into that on another episode. It's lovely, and essentially, it's not unlike a sort of more generic West Country rural burr, but it's essentially that, but as if you've got a blocked nose. So S's become Z's, K's become G's. You basically talk like that all the time. You have your nose blocked up.
For our listeners who can't see, Brice is holding his nose.
I was holding my nose there in case that didn't come across in the audio. So that very much was important to me. I also, in the telling of the story, I used a lot of dialect words, a lot of local dialect and slang words.
Yeah, those are very evocative.
They're lovely, aren't they?
I love chimbly, and terrible. What other ones have you got? I mean,
there's loads.
Shammocking,
shammocking, sprack is one. My favourite is the word for dizzy or drunken, which is wivery. Wivery. I don't actually think I used it in this story, but I did use it in the previous one. Drink wivery.
Yeah, you say drink wivery. Yeah.
Wivery to mean drunk is something I'm really doing my level best to revive in as many people as possible.
Yeah, onomatopoeic to some extent.
Yeah, there's others. Squanching is a nice one. Yeah, squanching, ruxing. Wassit is a good one. A wassit is a grumpy little pig.
Oh,
a wassit. That's what a wassit is. A snool is a little tiny airy thing. There's loads of them, and I used lots in there.
Snool is great.
Snool is good, isn't it?
I love the Great Witch calling the Little Witch a little snool.
Worsted, bustle-headed, all of these are lovely New Forest terms. Some of them appear in a few other places, but these are all explicitly New Forest dialect terms, which I love, and which I think really helps.
It's very nice the way that it connects it to it kind of confirms it as a specifically New Forest story. It links it to a locality.
I think it's important. So especially as in this story, something slightly subtler in that way is good, because in this story I didn't want to bog the listener down in all the place names. There's loads in the version as it exists in my book, New Forest Myths and Folklore, available at all good bookists. I retain all the place names, and there's a number of them. Ragged Boys Hill, I think I mention in the version I just did. I mentioned that because it's so explicitly related to the fairies. The term ragged is often used as almost as a euphemism to refer to fairies. Ragged boys or a ragged cult usually means the fairies. So we'll come back to that though, because I think there's a lot to say on that, on the ragged cult in particular. Yeah. But tying it down like that to the area is really important, I think, especially as this story, as I say, it hasn't been recorded before, hasn't been observed. I think just to give you an idea of these motifs, it would be worth going through them.
Go through a few of them, those Arne Thompson motifs that are in this story.
Yeah, if we go... So sequentially, if we go through some of these, I mean, I'm not going to give you the actual...
No, don't give me the references.
I'm not going to give you the references, although they are cool. So I would heartily recommend anyone who thinks that sounds interesting to look into it. I prefer Arne Thompson to Arne Thompson Uther, which is the innovation that was done to 20 years ago. We'll talk more about that knotty situation in the deep dive. But specifically Thompson's motif index is the one I'm most into. One of the first ones that we come across, aside from the very fact he's called Jack, because of course Jack is a classic everyman figure across.
I mean, there's loads of Jacks. You've got
folktale
and the Beanstalk, and Jill
of Kent, in Irons, I think, or Jack in Irons or Jack in Chains is a figure
in the box.
yeah, sure. There's countless. There's loads. In England, Jack is an everyman figure, as I say, and some people like to consider them all the same Jack, which is really fun. But Jack also just means person or bloke, guy, really. Hence Jack Frost. It's also short for John, which I've never really understood, but there it is. The first one, so aside from the name being Jack, the first one we come across is this forget-me-not thing. Now, that's a very, very, very well-known and well-collected New Forest little story. This version of that forget-me-not tale, which is itself very widespread across Britain, but and that had been
feels
picked up,
familiar.
That's been picked up before. If you read into any of the older guidebooks or books on the lore and the history and the culture of the area, very likely you'll come across a reference to that, and it acknowledges that it's well known everywhere. And it was in the 19th century. You'll see lots of references to this forget-me-not story. A forget-me-not is a kind of blue flower, for anyone who doesn't know. But usually, in every other version of this story, it's a man and a woman, lovers, are walking alongside the banks. Usually the woman sees the beautiful flowers, so the man goes to collect them, goes to pick them, slips in the bank and falls into the river and is swept away and says, forget-me-not.
Okay, so it's the man who gets swept away.
In every other instance, it's the man who gets swept away and the woman who survives. But the New Forest says, no, the woman must die. The woman must die, although she potentially does not die. Instead, she is rescued. So there's that cool forget-me-not thing. That's a classic. Then we get the tell Tiddy Cole that Grand Colin is dead. That's a classic motif that we see across the record.
Wait, what's the motif there?
It's actually called King of the Cats. Or King of the Fairies, that motif.
Oh, okay.
Which is essentially, the reason it's King of the Cats as well is because in some versions, it is a traveller. He's visiting some friend, and he looks on the friend's door, and he comes in, he says, God, you'll never guess just what happened to me. Can I have a cup of tea and sit down? I'll tell you about this. So the visitor gets him a cup of tea, and he sits down in a nice comfy chair by the fire. The fire's going nicely. The little house cat is curled up by it. Everything is nice. And so the host says, all right, tell me what's happened. The guy says, oh, well, I was on my way here and I was walking past this little hill, and the hill called my name and said, tell Wimblestimble that the King of Cats is dead. And then the host says, he said what? And then the man replies, he said, tell Wimblestimble that the King of Cats is dead. And then the host says, he said what? And then again he says, tell Wimblestimble that the King of Cats is dead. At which point the house cat pricks up his ears, leaps to standing, bellows out, then I am the King of all cats! And he runs out the room and he goes and gets crowned. And that's a classic tale. It's a cat's tale, I suppose. So that's it with cats, but it's also done with fairies and with pixies. I think one would hope that the fairy versions are older, but who cares? I mean, cats are essentially fairies in and of themselves anyway. So again, we see that as a classic one, but that has been localized.
Yeah.
That's a classic motif, but Gran Colin and Tiddy Cole are two local fairies, two local pixies, rather. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, I've come across similar pixies in, I think, Jersey or one of the Channel Islands.
One of them's big, one of them's
One's
little.
big and one's little. And in the New Forest, they throw snogs or scoils back and forth across the forest to each other. Uh-huh. And so for anyone who's listening who doesn't know what a snog or a scoil is, and I can't imagine there's many of you, in the New Forest, there's this old tradition of hunting squirrels, especially at Christmas time and around New Year. The local word for squirrel is a scug, and so this squirrel hunting was called scugging. And the way that scugs were scugged was with these sort of small, slightly curved cudgel type things with a slightly bulbous end, a bit like a shillelagh. So a New Forest weapon, a slightly curved stick about the length of your forearm, maybe,
but
with a bulbous end.
They're designed to be thrown, are they?
So there's two types. There's scoils and snogs.
Yeah.
A scoil is one that is only weighted with the wood. Yeah. So it's just all wood, and it's bulbous at one end. So I believe those ones are for throwing. So people would throw the scoils at squirrels, at the scugs, as they were in the trees or as they were leaping from tree to tree. They would then fall down, and either they'd already be knocked out or they would then be caught. And then I think the snog would come into play. And the snog is weighted with lead and is much heavier. Yeah. And is a whole other thing. I have handled actual snogs, period snogs from 100 years or 200 years ago, and they are very heavy and not the whole balance of them. They wouldn't do for throwing at all. So I think that they would have been used like a poacher's priest. Have you ever heard of that phrase?
No, I have
poacher's priest. Oh, it's horrible. It's wonderful. A poacher's priest is basically that. It's a lead-weighted stick you would carry to put an animal you'd injured to kill it off. Yeah. To smash it.
The last rites.
Fishermen always have. I don't know what they call them. But they always have a stick that they'll just bash the fish's head in with. To finish him off. Well, not always, but the ones I've encountered do. So a poacher's priest. So I think that that's what the snog operated as. Also, in smuggling raids, I think they would often be used as a little bit of personal defense too.
Of course.
And just as a general purpose cudgel, no bad thing. So
the addendum to that story, though, about the snogs is about the I think you should tell it. It's the circus coming to town.
The Scuggy Pie. Oh, the circus. That's fun. Yeah. So there's this lovely detail that I found. Because of this huge prevalence of scugging, throwing the sticks to take down the squirrels.
It's a local
hobby. As the classic thing across the New Forest, or everyone did it. Everyone loved it. Whenever a traveling circus or a traveling fair came through, they would never bother setting up the circus the coconut shy in the New Forest because everybody had such a good throwing arm that they could just take down all the coconuts, which is lovely.
Yeah.
So this was all then, they were baked into pies. Mm-hmm. Scuggy pies was a classic local Christmas delicacy.
Which I've yet to try.
People would go on great big scuggy hunts, scugging away, and then everything would be clicked up, and then they would all be baked into a lovely big pie. And as I say, recipes survive. And as to the menus, this was not even the wild thing is this is legal today because grey squirrels are classified as vermin. And so if you go out, you can go out scugging. There's nothing to stop you going out, hunting squirrels, scugging them, and then turning them into pies.
Maybe I will.
Every Christmas. Yeah, it would be good. And true inaction of folk culture. It's also the only way that we are likely to be able to reintroduce red squirrels in this country is if we can incentivize the culling of the greys. Mm-hmm. Heavy stuff for the Fighting Folklore podcast.
Yeah.
If you don't like that, please leave a comment and explain why.
Dark territories.
Dark territories. Dark grey territories, in fact.
It would be nice to see some red squirrels.
It would be lovely to see some. They have them on the Isle of Wight, which is not too far. When I think we might be telling. Are we telling Arwold later on in this season?
I'm not sure if that's this season.
Or maybe next season we'll tell you an Isle of Wight story. It's in the book. It's in the book. It's in the book. New Forest Myths and Folklore by Brice Stratford. Very, very good book. Very good book. Everyone agrees. The reason I mentioned stonks and scoils, though, is because essentially, anyone who's in the forest, if you randomly get hit in the head with a stray scoil,
then you blame it.
on the Pixies. It was Gran Colin and Tiddy
because they're always throwing sticks at each other.
Sticks across the forest.
Brilliant.
And I think there is.
It wasn't me. It was Gran Colin.
Pixies. I think that there's, as I say in Jersey, I forget what they're called, but I think there's a similar one big, one little pair of Pixies who throw I think they play cricket across the island. So there's always a cricket ball flying.
I guess
so if you get hit by a ball, then
local thing, depending on the Pixies, what tends to be flying through the air.
What tends to be flying through the air, which is really fun. Yeah. So this King of the Fairies motif has been tied to those local figures and to a local place. I think so. There is a barrow, which is a burial ground, an ancient burial ground in the forest, which is called Colin's Grave.
So the barrow is Gran Colin's grave.
Yes, it's literally Colin's grave.
So it's him.
It's actually him. It's I think the idea. He's in the grave and he's like just waiting there. And when someone goes past,
informing
he's like,
the world.
Hey, sorry, Jack. Can you tell?
Just tell. I've gone and died. Can you tell everyone?
Tell Tiddy Cole that Gran Colin's dead. Yeah. And that's it. So he's just lying there.
Oh, I like that he's announcing it for himself.
Well, this is so in line with with fairies in general, with Pixies. This ridiculous. It's like children playing a game. Everything has this element of unseriousness to it, which I really, really, really enjoy. Especially as there's this non-linear time thing going on. Because in other stories that are definitely more recent, Gran Colin is still the king of the Pixies. It's like everything is like a game. I think like a child's game.
Oh, that's a lovely way to look at it.
Yeah, that's how.
I was also thinking
logic.
When in this story, because it's a fairy tale, it was occurring to me to like, is this for kids? Is it not for kids? Is it a grown-up story? And it feels. I mean, it is family friendly. It's colourful and fun. I think this story is appealing to children, but I don't feel like it's a children's story.
No, I don't feel like it's a children's story. I mean, any story that you tell as children, is a children's story, and the inverse of that is also true.
I mean, certainly, I feel like this is more appealing to children than Red King, White Ship.
But even then, I feel like this idea that fairy tales are just for children it's not true. It's a very, very modern idea, and I think we often see this folk crafts or folk traditions will become something taught to children almost.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the same with things like, the public holidays, Christmas and Easter.
It becomes about the children.
They didn't used to be about children, but they are about children now.
In a way, it's almost, I think people can allow themselves to engage with things when they're using children as a proxy. They can enjoy it vicariously.
You're allowed to have fun if it's kids.
Yeah, it's bleak and this horrible post-industrial mechanized capitalist society. Tear down the walls, James. Tear them down. Free the child within. So there's that element, the Gran Colin, Tiddy Cole, King of the Fairies thing. That then moves into this idea of Jack witnessing this coronation and then trying to chase them.
He chases Tiddy Cole out.
Yep.
Up and down.
And he sees, he then pursues the fairies. He sees lights there, so he chases after them, they go out. Then he sees more over there, he chases that, they go out, and then that leads him into the middle of nowhere, into a bog.
And that's where we get the Ragged Colt.
Yeah, then the Ragged Colt comes. And that little chase is a classic Will-o'-the-Wisp thing.
Yep.
Which...
Yeah, kind of he's led off the path into the dangerous bog.
Specifically by this weird light.
By lights.
Yeah, now that is a classic fairy trope.
Yeah.
But it's also based on some fact, as if, not that fairies aren't. Okay, I want more angry fairy letters, please. But this is something called Ignus Fatus, which we will speak more of in a future episode, I think episode 5, when it comes to Halloween. And essentially this is, you don't see it much anymore, but this is a naturally occurring phenomenon where I think the theory is that natural gas from and on the ground ignites and burns out.
Yeah, right.
And so under certain weather conditions in certain landscapes, you can see these little lights. And when you think of an age when there's no electric street lights, there's no torches, there's no phones with lights on, you're in the middle of the pitch black, your lantern goes out, and then you suddenly see in the far distance a little light, especially if you're lost.
Yeah.
You pursue that. And then, there's someone I can talk to, I can get a match or whatever. And then you get there, there's someone there, then you see it further off. And then before you know it, you're lost in the pitch black, in a bog. It's genuinely life-threatening at this stage, yeah.
It'll drag you down.
You get a lot of that in older stories. I think a lot of bogs have been drained, but you do still get that in parts of the forest where we've got the New Forest is internationally famous for its ecological value. It has a phenomenal array of heathland, woodland, and wetland, and in the wetlands you'll still get this phenomena, which is a fascinating thing to see. This is also related to the origin of jack-o'-lanterns, which is why we're going to save it for a Halloween episode. And I go into deep detail in my next book, my upcoming book,
the Halloween.
Halloween ghost stories. Yeah, that's it. You got it right. Good man. Yeah, Halloween folklore and ghost stories. Yeah, I go into
available for pre-order.
Yeah, it is. Head over to Amazon as at this very moment, and you can pre-order that book.
Should be out well in time for Halloween this year.
I really hope that. I really hope it is. I really hope it is. So we've got that. Then after that, he runs home to his mother. She tells him to go find the witches. We have the weird Great Witch, Little Witch thing.
Yeah.
Which is brilliant. And as I say, that one is far more unique. That doesn't really have much precedent. However, this whole thing of the fairy ointment does. That is a classic fairy tale motif.
Yeah.
Fairy ointment, which is an ointment which you rub it in your eye and it allows you to see the fairies.
Things that are invisible.
Yeah.
In general.
Yeah. In general, fairies? But it's specifically usually the fairies. It's usually the fairies, yeah. Mm-hmm. And this is a major part of a lot of fairy stories. A classic trope is this idea of the fairy's midwife. That's a weird one because, of course, in Romeo and Juliet, the Mercutio's famous speech about Queen Mab refers to her as the fairy's midwife.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she's the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone upon the forefinger of an alderman, I believe. I don't know.
I'm not familiar with that speech. I haven't looked at that speech properly.
And what's interesting about that is that we've already said that she's a queen, so it's weird that she's also a midwife. Yeah. And what's odd is that in all the folklore, fairies, for some reason, have difficulty giving birth. And so when a fairy queen or a fairy woman is pregnant, the fairies will go and find a human midwife and give her this ointment in her eye so she can see the fairies, and then take her to help the fairy give birth. Mm-hmm. I don't know why that is, but that's a classic trope within these stories.
Very interesting. The really way the fairies have these sort of almost biological kind of qualities that are consistent. Well, they have a different, I don't know, just a different way of being than...
We'll go deeper into this whole thing of them giving birth and gender in the deep dive video, because this whole thing of whether fairies are male or female is fascinating. And I don't think we have time to really get into the nitty gritty of it in this chat. But if that sounds like it might be of interest to you, then do keep your eyes and ears open for our deep dive video on this. In fact, head over to our Finding Folklore YouTube channel and subscribe. Mm-hmm. And while you're at it, you can catch up on the deep dive for episode 1, which is very, very interesting. So there's this idea of the fairy ointment, which gives him sight. That's a classic trope, as I say. Usually then that allows you to see the fairies, and then very often right at the end, which is what happens in this, just as he thinks everything's wonderful and now he's going to make his riches.
Gets his eye poked out.
He gets his eye poked out. And sometimes it's just, it isn't always that the eye was literally removed. Yeah. Sometimes it's just that, like, I don't know, this little fairy figure gestures to his eye and it's gone, or he throws water in his face and it washes the ointment out. But sometimes he just pokes out his eye, which I prefer. And that's what we have in this. Mm-hmm. That's a classic one. And then is there any other?
Well, right at the end, we get the sort of out of nowhere, we get told that he's the seventh son of the seventh son.
Oh, well, yeah. So the seventh son of the seventh son, that's again, classic stuff.
It's definitely one I've heard of before, but I'm not really sure.
That's kind of ubiquitous everywhere. The seventh son of the seventh son is ubiquitous. Usually it's that they're more magical. They'll become a sorcerer or a wizard or something. We get it. We see it a lot. It's really been taken up by fantasy literature and media in general. In the New Forest, it's specifically, it's more folk magic based. It's more cunning man style. Yeah. So a seventh son of a seventh son can perform cures. And cures aren't necessarily cures in the sense we think of them. They can include things that are more like magic charms. Mm-hmm. Charms might be a more appropriate word in terms of trying to understand the meaning of that. Yeah. It also interestingly emphasizes that he's not the eldest son. The eldest son or the firstborn child are usually, certainly within the New Forest, are considered to be immune to the tricks of Puck, Pug, and the Pixies. Mm-hmm. they can't touch him. I don't know why that is, but it's true.
Uh-huh. You're a first.
Yes, I'm fine. They can't get me, Jim.
Oh, I'm vulnerable.
Yeah, you're very vulnerable. You're not even the seventh son of a seventh son.
No.
Not even close. You're the third son of a, I don't know, how many?
Third son of a first son.
Third son of a first son. God, it's the worst possible combination.
But we skipped over the fairy feast.
The fairy feast, of course, yes. So yeah, there are two more elements, certainly, I think. There's this idea of the fairy feast, which is specifically, there are three. So in order to get to the fairy feast, he's had to go into fairyland, right? Now, this idea of fairyland or elfland existing in the earth and being somewhere that's an other world, but also somewhere that's travelable to. Often, I think in this, it's through the spine stone, which is a weird phrase. A very nice one. Yeah, the spine stone, I think, which is lovely.
Yeah.
Through the spine stone, which that's interesting because in the New Forest, the heart of oak is often referred to as the tree's spine.
Uh-huh.
I haven't come across that elsewhere. I think that might just be a local thing, but I don't know. So yeah, in this sense, there's this weird cloven stone or rock or barrow. I think it's on Ragged Boy's Hill, actually, where you can then travel through it and you're in the land of fairy, in Elfland.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in Elfland, you can leave, you're safe, so long as you don't eat any food or drink any drink. That's a classic thing.
Right. So
we'll get that in
when Jack is on the verge of drinking the wine, he's in terrible danger.
So that might not come across. But if he actually did drink the wine and eat the food, then he would have been stuck forever. He could never have escaped. Then he realizes, thanks to the forget-me-nots, he realizes right at the last minute, the little blue flowers there remind him of the entire saga.
Of his sweetheart.
Yeah, I almost forgot. So fortunately, he's saved. He then, and this is another trope, he runs over and he picks up his sweetheart to save her.
Mm-hmm.
The pixies all around him then start turning her into different things. That is again a
something you're trying to hold on to something and it transforms into.
And they keep making various other things. We see this on a lot of other fairy tales. It's a classic motif, even down to the fact that the last thing that she gets turned into is a hot coal, which then burns him. And so, in order to cool off, he has to jump into water, into a well, and it hisses, and that succeeds. And that also then gets him back through to the human world, to the Middle Earth.
Where he meets the King of England.
The King of all England.
The King of all England.
The King of all England. And he proffers to him, as proof of his adventures, the goblet, which he's still clutching.
Is that another motif?
It is another motif. Uh-huh. And in fact, there is, I forget where, but in Scotland somewhere, there is some stately home or clan castle where there is a family tale, a local story where similar occurs.
Oh, right.
And I think they certainly used to, and I think they still do. I think they still have the goblet, which was supposedly brought from fairyland.
Oh, well, that proves that it's true.
Which proves
then.
that it's all true. Yeah, which proves that fairyland's a real thing. So this is real. I think that covers pretty much all the bigger motifs off the top of my head. Yeah. Anyway, if there's more, we'll deal with them in the deep dive. But though each of those elements are motifs that we see in fairy tales and folk tales collected from across Britain, from the 1700s through the 1800s, 1900s, up to the present day.
Yeah, so this story is really quite a good example of how that the motif index
can
works.
Be used. Yeah, how it works exactly. And also of how those motifs and the fact they've been classified, that is not a restrictive or diminishing thing. Actually, it's fascinating to be able to recognize the recurring motifs, to also recognize these witches turning into hills, which is really weird.
Where it steps outside.
That's not usual. Usually, you might get a dragon.
Into a hill.
Yeah, no. Usually, the corpse of a dragon or a giant will, in time, become a hill. But a living thing, and certainly not a witch, is not just turned into a hill. That's very rare. I haven't come across that elsewhere.
Particularly love the way that they both that's what they both do to each other.
They have the same idea. Very satisfying, isn't it? And again, this is a lovely bit of folk etymology. They could well have been called Great Witch and Little Witch because one had, I don't know, maybe they both had witch elms on. One had a big witch elm, one had a small witch elm. But that was back in the 1300s. And then over the years, that's been forgotten. The names remain.
Bit of reverse engineering.
Yeah, exactly. Folk etymology is what we call that. Etymology. It's backwards projected explanations for names. Mm-hmm. And I'm not interested in debunking that because I really I just prefer the story of the witches being turned into hills. Yeah. Much nicer. And so that's really nice. So that is an example not only of something that's not a classic motif, but also something that's ultra localized. And then you can also recognize the motifs, the standard motifs, which have been localized, like the King of the Fairies being tied to two local figures and to a local place specifically.
Yeah,
and we see this across this tale, which is so satisfying. I would encourage everyone, in fact, to just have a look into the motif index. There's also the Arne Thompson or Arne Thompson Uther, though I prefer just the Arne Thompson folk tale classification system, which covers the types of tale. And then those types of tale cross-reference with the motif index, which is really what the one I'm much more excited by and interested in the motif index. I encourage everyone to look into that and to start recognizing those motifs just in all stories, in film, in literature, recent and historic, and to start seeing it in the world around you, because you'd be amazed at how often you can
certainly.
See
I'm gonna look into this.
Yeah,
you've piqued my interest.
You're amazed how often you're walking by a hill and it calls your name. Like it happens. These things happen.
So speaking of things that are kind of rooted to the local area, we are here talking about pixies specifically,
yes.
not fairies.
Not fairies. Well, yeah, pixies as a type of fairy.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that fairies is very much a broad term. There isn't one single type of being which is a fairy.
Yeah.
Often when people think of the fairy, they think of the little winged Tinkerbell type thing, which is the classic Victorian flower fairy figure. But that's a literary being, that is not a folkloric being. In a folkloric sense, fairy really is the place that they all come from.
Yeah.
So they're all beings of fairy. Yeah. Different regions have different names for the things that are there, and have different.
Pixie is from
Pixie is the local one here, and whether it's a pixie or a brownie or a hob or whatever, they have different characteristics. Now, interestingly, what's interesting about the pixie thing here is that, generally speaking, when people think of pixies, they think of Devon or piskies in Cornwall. Cornwall and Devon are the sort of the most famous area of pixie lore.
Yeah,
and I'm including piskies, and pixies is the same thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes people will acknowledge that goes on into Somerset, but generally that's where it ends. Now, interestingly,
and those are all connected. Those are all that's like a continuous region.
Yes, that's a contiguous region. Those are three. Those are the three westernmost counties in England.
Oh yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, the counties in England, they're the southwest.
They go deep in the southwest. We've got Cornwall, then Devon, then Somerset, then Dorset, then Hampshire, which is above.
Hampshire is where we are.
We're in Hampshire, and then it goes to West Sussex and then East Sussex.
So do you know what it is that Dorset has? They don't have pixies.
Well, actually, Dorset does have pixies. The only places where the pixie law remained really, really, really current was in Cornwall and Devon, and then in the New Forest. A lot of people have misunderstood this to think that pixies didn't exist elsewhere along the south coast, but in fact they did. In fact, if you look into old place names and really old written evidence, you will find traces of pixies, specifically the word pixies, across the south coast. What that means
is just in like the names of hills and towns and stuff,
and barrows and even the odd diaries and things, references to stories. There are a couple here and there of traditions and stories of pixies that have survived. It's a misnomer that it's all just Devon and Cornwall. Yeah. It's just that they have survived the most in Cornwall and Devon, and then weirdly again in this pocket, which is the New Forest. The question of why that would be is really interesting.
Yeah.
There's a very widespread theory about fairy belief, why it survives so strongly in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall, and the islands. So what is commonly referred to as the Celtic fringe. The theory is that the fairies have survived there because they are this ancient Celtic belief. They are perhaps Celtic gods who have been turned in over the centuries to these fairies. That's why there's very strong belief in them. That's why the fairy lore has survived along the Celtic fringe because fairy lore is Celtic mythology.
Uh-huh.
Right? That it has this. Now, that's one of those explanations that sounds really sensible at a cursory glance.
Sounds all right to me.
Yeah, but that's because you're a fool, Jim.
Oh, no.
You're a damn fool. As are many people. It's one of those ones that sounds like it makes sense, but if you actually analyze it even briefly, it doesn't make any sense. Okay. Because the survival... yeah, the idea is then in this theory that the reason that it survives there and not elsewhere in England is because elsewhere in England was Anglo-Saxon. So the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the settlement obliterated all the Celtic fairy lore, and the Celtic fairy lore only survived in those areas on the Celtic fringe which remained culturally Celtic, whatever that may mean. The reason that's stupid is that fairy lore did not exist 1,500 years ago. And the bulk of these fairies are much more recent. There's no actual evidence that predates the Anglo-Saxons for the existence of any of this fairy lore. And furthermore, fairy lore did exist across England until a couple of hundred years ago. This is not a survival of 1.5 millennia ago. This is a survival of 1.5 centuries ago.
Does that theory even account for the survival of pixies in the New Forest?
No, that theory is not even aware there is a survival of pixies in the New Forest. As I say, it's one which it is a theory which is, it's one of those theories, there must be a name for this, but I don't know what it is. Solutions or theories which are not designed to help aid further investigation or to get you close to the truth, but rather to stop investigation, to stop you thinking
shutting
about it.
down conversation.
It's a way of shutting it down. So if you just, that's the reason for that. There you go. Lovely. Oh, if there's a ghost sighting, it's a hoax. There you go. It doesn't matter that the evidence you've got for it being a hoax doesn't hold water. You've decided it's a hoax. That way you can stop thinking about it. You've decided this is a Celtic survival, so you stop thinking about it. The fact is, Celtic is a fairly meaningless umbrella term, and that fringe does not have in any way ubiquitous culture. It doesn't account for any of the pixie lore that exists outside of that. It also doesn't account for a lot of other things, which I won't waste breath on.
Yeah.
But the key point here is that these are not survivals of 1,500 years ago. They are a survival of a couple of centuries ago. So what happened a couple of centuries ago? Certainly the Anglo-Saxons didn't invade and then obliterate Celtic culture in all of England. So that's not the reason, is it?
I feel like that was a bit longer ago.
That was definitely a bit longer ago. What happened a couple of centuries ago was the spread of universal education in this kind of concentric circle from London outwards.
Right.
Mass schooling. And there was an active obliteration of a lot of folk culture.
Okay.
A lot of superstitions. It was an active campaign from the 18th, from the Age of Enlightenment onwards, essentially. And it radiated out from London. And when you looked at it like that, the Celtic fringe also happens to be the ring, the halo of the British Isles that is the furthest from London. The further from London you get, the more of these survivals and hangers-on you will find.
Sure.
Now, the question is, though, why specifically pixies in the New Forest?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
So we've got them along the south coast. Now, to tell the answer to this, we're going to jump away from fairies and towards ghosts. There's loads, and in all will become clear to you, James. All become as clear as a translucent phantom.
Well, good. Tell me about these ghosts.
There are certain, much as we've got these fairy tale motifs, there are certain ghost sighting motifs, haunting motifs. Perhaps I will compile the Stratford haunting motif repository. Maybe that's a good idea. That would be useful, wouldn't it? Maybe I'll do that. All right. No one else do it. I came up with it. It's mine. So there are certain classic things we see with hauntings, which are very commonplace. A lot of pubs, you'll get, there's the ghost of a nursemaid here. And so you'll see her carrying a candle in the night. So you have a mysterious candle in the middle of the night. When there should be no candles, you'll see it through a window.
Spooky.
Classic.
Yep.
You'll also hear the sound of barrels rolling. That's a classic. Phantom sounds of barrels rolling is another one. Those are both very common things.
The ghosts of some pub workers.
Presumably, yes, that's what it sounds like.
An endless cycle of doing their job.
Stone tape theory, yes. You familiar with stone tape?
I am familiar with stone tape. People doing things in a particular place, it gets engraved into the very material of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and then can be played
yeah.
like a stone tape. Yeah. That's a theory for what ghosts are. It's also the name of a very good...
Especially that's when it's a very emotional... moment of high
the theory is that under certain circumstances, it could be high emotion or distress, or it could also just be an intensely repeated thing, which is why you'll often see
somebody walking their rounds.
Monks on procession in a ruined abbey, people walking through walls where there used to be a door, or Roman soldiers marching. These are classic things. Yeah. There's a very good... I say very good. It's quite dated, but I enjoy it very much. 1970s British play for the day sort of made-for-TV film called The Stone Tape, which I recommend. It's a good... It's dated, but it's good.
Check it out. A lot of that stuff is on YouTube, so
I think that is on YouTube.
I would recommend checking out these play for the day type things.
We will do a whole deep dive on those. Separate deep dive just on on that weird British 70s TV horror, because that's some great stuff there.
It's so good. There's so much of it available as well for free.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about now. In fact, one might say that mass media is akin to the universal education that was provided a couple of centuries ago, which obliterated a lot of fairy lore to go full circle. Yeah.
But so we have the candles being carried, and we have the rolling barrels in these pubs.
There's loads of other things. It was common for... you've heard of a haunted house. That's a normal thing. An old derelict house. It's been empty for 50 years. Yeah. Often it'll be quite a big old stately home that no one is keeping up for tax purposes or because of a death.
And yet there's sounds.
Boarded up for years. There's sounds. There's lights. There's creatures in there. Or old ruined chapels or whatever. There's people are sighted in the dark. That sort of thing. There's loads of these stories. When I was researching the New Forest Myths and Folklore book, which I recommend you obtain a copy of if you haven't already, I came across this really cool story from Notes and Queries. I can't be bothered to find the specific date. It's all in the book. Mm-hmm. But it was about this really weird... It was about a milestone. So on the road... I've mentioned Burley already, I think. Yeah. On the road between Burley and Lymington, I believe, there's a really high bank on one side. And on this really high bank, there's a milestone. It's about head height. It's weird. And it's dated. It's a memorial stone to the Treaty of Amiens. And it's just a milestone that points you in either direction to the next settlement. I found in this Notes and Queries a report that all across Burley, there was this idea that this milestone makes noises at night. And it said half of the village swears blind that they can hear this milestone making noises of horses' hooves or chains being dragged or men talking. And the other half swears blind they can't hear anything. And it does point out that the people who have better hearing are the ones who swear they can hear it. Really weird. Just a really weird random little fragment of story. There's also other things which are worth mentioning here, other traditions. There's something called, to bring it back to Pixies. Yeah. There's a tradition of, so you wake up, obviously there's lots of things that fairies do. They might turn the milk or do some other thing.
That happened to me recently.
Yeah, I know it did. Yeah, it was horrible.
Oh, you were meant to drink the tea,
I drank the tea. Yeah, it was a horrible experience. Various other things that the fairies are supposed to do. Interestingly, in the New Forest, Pixies tend to have a less domestic character than they do elsewhere. The Pixies in the forest don't really turn milk or mess with your shoes or or clean your house. They're more about the forest itself rather than the domestic sphere. Whereas in other places, they are overtly concerned with that. Yeah. There is a classic thing they do, which is when you get up in the morning, you go out, you go to your stable, you go to your horse or your pony to saddle them up and use them on a day of work. But the thing, instead of being rested and raring to go, is all sweating and tired and ragged. And it's like as if it's been worked all night. That's called a pony being pixie-led, sometimes hag-led. Hag as in witch.
Well, so the witch or the pixie has had the horse out all night.
Yeah. Precisely. But if you allow that to happen, you go, oh, well, then quite often the Pixies will give you some kind of a gift. Who knows what that might be, but it's quite nice. I've even found a few pubs in the forest. There are at least 3 still going, where the landlords every night after closing put out a full pint of beer, just leave it on the back door.
For the Pixies.
For the Pixies. For the Pixies.
Great.
3 exist. I'm not allowed to say which they are, but one of them does just use the dregs from all the...
Oh, dear.
Which so be careful.
The Pixies,
you don't know which one
Pixies aren't fussy.
Yeah, well, maybe so. Maybe so.
I hope so.
All of that suddenly makes sense when you remember what it is that connects Cornwall and Devon with the New Forest. So it wasn't just that universal education spreads out and eradicates lots of superstitions. Mm-hmm. There was another thing going on here. The eradication of smuggling over the 19th century, of the early to mid 19th century, was very effective. And it was only in Cornwall and Devon that smuggling remained a major, a ubiquitous element of the people, of the masses.
Yeah.
In Cornwall and Devon, partly due to their isolated nature and partly because they are so coastal, pretty much everybody, more or less, remains involved to a greater or lesser, a direct or indirect degree with the free trade, the smuggling trade, right up throughout the 19th century, even into the 20th century. The rest of the country, for the most part, excluding a few pockets on the parts of the landmass, it's eradicated through a lot of hard work.
But in your book, there's a lot of New Forest smuggling stories.
Yes, there is. The one place on the south coast where it wasn't eradicated was the New Forest, and in the New Forest, it remains right again into the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Smuggling is a ubiquitous pastime for everyone. This is partly because I think culturally, the practice of commoning, the commoners of the New Forest, for anyone who doesn't know, we won't go into it now because that will derail us, but it's fascinating stuff. New Forest commoners are a cultural minority in their own right, and they practice something called commoning, which is subtly different to where it exists anywhere else. It is an ancient agricultural practice which involves certain rights over the use of the forest itself to turn your livestock out onto, and then the use of the forest itself for certain fuels and so on. We won't go into it now.
In the end, it ends up as a really kind of lovely coexistence with the environment and taking care of your
The New Forest exists as it does today, explicitly and exclusively thanks to commoning. There is no distinction between the commoners and the forest itself. You remove one and you kill the other. And that works in both directions. I'm not exaggerating.
But how does that connect to
smuggling? Because commoners in general, it's not, certainly historically, it's not so much a trade, it's a lifestyle, it's a way of life. And smuggling being established as an aspect of a way of life within the forest meant that these things worked quite well together. They
makes it quite hard to eliminate.
You can't. It's very difficult because
it's tied to so many different things. Yeah, it's supported in a way.
In the New Forest, Burley was the center of smuggling, but you get it across the board.
Yeah.
Now, to tie it all together, a very common thing that smugglers would do is exploit superstition for their activities.
They're the ones who are using the horses at night.
Yes, they are.
I might have twigged about this a little while ago.
It's commonplace. And if you think about it like that, it makes perfect sense. Okay, so you wake up, the smugglers have used your horses all night. You don't make a fuss about it, so you get a present. They leave you a big parcel of tobacco or a bottle of brandy. Other things. Suddenly, don't go into that old derelict house. It's haunted. Stay away from there. Don't look to see who's going in and out of that place.
Don't listen to the sounds of all the barrels rolling.
Yeah. Or ignore the candle in the window. Furthermore, so as I say, Burley is the center of New Forest smuggling. How funny then that there's this magical phantom sounds of chains being dragged in the middle of the night
and men talking and horses talking.
And if anybody were to hear that and then go and complain to the authorities, tell the excisemen that what they've heard, the excisemen would say, "Oh, you're just a silly local yokel. Look at your funny rustic superstitions. He thinks he can hear the stone." dismissed completely.
Those clever smugglers.
It's very, very clever. Mm-hmm. Now, the same smuggling gangs operated along the south coast, and they interacted and engaged with each other. It is totally plausible that the phrase pixie would have been popularized and encouraged by all those gangs.
It's part of their specific dialogue.
They engage with pixies. So, of course, they are encouraging pixie folklore across their entire patch.
Favouring it to any other words.
So it goes, because that's, So across the entire south coast, you get pixie folklore actively encouraged. You're not getting brownie folklore encouraged because that's being encouraged up north.
So pixies survive
where different gangs are operating. Yeah. And so we get pixies spread over the entire patch of those south coast gangs.
Yeah.
And then when the smuggling fades and is choked out, the few pockets where smuggling remains are the few pockets where pixies remain.
Brilliant. This is a really good theory.
It's cool. It's entirely my own as well.
This is yours.
Completely original. This is my theory. Yeah, this is my theory.
You heard it here first.
Yes, you did. Unless, I have mentioned it a couple of talks, but this is it. I think this is the first time it's been documented for the ages. So there.
I really like that theory.
Yeah, I know. I think it really fits. It also makes... I love when you come up with a theory and it unlocks all these weird different things. Suddenly they fit together and it almost blossoms. All these odd internecine facts and motifs and elements, which in isolation seem so jagged and weird and inexplicable.
Suddenly they all lock into place like a mechanism.
It's really gratifying. I think it is certainly an infinitely more plausible theory than the nonsensical Celtic survival anti-theory, which, as I say, I call it an anti-theory because it is not about unlocking anything. It's just about you don't look at it anymore. It's just about stop thinking about it.
Strange.
I dislike that sort of thing. And I really love the lovely, lovely, lovely things, the good, constructive, positive theories that help you understand things at a deper level. Pixie itself as a word is very interesting because, of course, pixie likely relates to puck and puck. We can talk at length about this in the deep dive because we should on time.
Before we go any further, we should talk a little bit about puck and about the kind of Shakespearean connection. Just briefly touch on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. We should touch on it
because we have the ragged cult. I don't think we've spoken much about
the ragged cult is a form of puck. In fact, we see puck turning into a ragged cult in this, and puck exists across certainly New Forest folklore. There's loads of place names that focus on puck pits, for example, where we actually rehearsed A Midsummer Night's Dream some years ago.
We of course worked on it was great fun.
Puck also exists across the country. Puck is not unique to here. Puck and pixie is an interesting overlap. There's a lot of reason to think that a puck is the same thing, essentially. A puck, a puxie, a pixie. Plus various other similar things. The origin of puck is very obscure. Puka exists earlier, but weirdly, puka exists in Old Irish, but it also exists in Old English. A similar word. So the origin of it may be older still. It may be Indo-European.
Could be really old.
Could be really old. So it could be from before a time when the Celtic peoples and the Germanic peoples were different peoples. Back to when they were one people and there was something called a pick or a pika or something like that.
Wow.
Who knows? But so really, really, really old. And loads and loads and loads of things seem to relate. This is in contradistinction to the word fairy, which is much more recent. The word fairy comes from the Norman French or the Old French fay, which does itself come from the Latin word for fate, or the Greek, maybe. I'm not sure. Is that Latin or Greek? You don't know. You fool, I don't know. You idiot. What a moron.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know either. But it comes from the word fate.
Yeah.
Or the etymological root of the word fate. Yeah. Which is in itself interesting. We see this puck stuff repeatedly, and that's not so much an invention by Shakespeare. That's very much Renaissance fairy lore.
When we were working on the play, we did look at some other texts which were about Puck or Robin Goodfellow or just generally fairy stuff. and a lot of the same phrases pop up again and again.
Yeah, a lot of these
stuff
same
like
figures.
Slipping through keyholes, and in fact that sequence that is in your story of turning into a horse, a headless bear. Yeah, I think
that's actually so. It's funny.
In Shakespeare, it's a horse, a hound, a headless bear, fire.
The horse and hound thing is fairly commonplace, and the fire we've mentioned already. The Ignis Fatuus, the Fatus, the Ignis Fatuus, the Will o' the Wisp thing.
Yeah,
the headless bear is really cool and weird because the headless bear, the image of a headless bear, pretty much sort of from around Shakespeare onwards, becomes really commonplace. This classic horrible monster thing is a headless bear.
Was that popularized by Shakespeare?
Well, weirdly, it actually... So bearing in mind how widespread it is, right up to the 20th century, it seems like it must have been popularized by Shakespeare. It didn't come from Shakespeare. Yeah. In 1580-something, there was a pamphlet released. So just before Shakespeare.
That's only a little bit
smidge before Shakespeare. A pamphlet released which actually attested to a supposedly real-life, true account of a woman who engaged with the devil, and he appeared to her as a headless bear and essentially picked her up and rolled around her house and threw her downstairs and beat her up horribly. A literal headless bear.
As a headless bear.
It struck that image, which seems to originate there, was so striking to everybody. It might have been the 1560s, actually. 1568, maybe. I don't know. But it was so striking to everybody that it became huge thereafter. Everyone after that became obsessed with this idea, the concept of a headless bear. The connection with the devil is also interesting because certainly in late medieval and early modern thought, there was an ambiguous relationship between hell and the devil and devils and fairies.
Yes.
There was a theory that fairies were neither of heaven or hell, but leased their existence from the devil. So they weren't technically of the devil, but they were related to the devil. Weirdly.
It gets quite complicated, all of that.
There's a lot of those. Again, that's because these are the attempts to classify them rather than an acceptance of them as... these are the attempts to create an epistemological structure, a framework within which they exist, rather than just enjoying them as a weird hodgepodge being. Yeah. Which is what they are.
See, the Renaissance, they love to do the categorization as well. Almost as much as we do now.
Almost. Now, that's interesting because then what we see is this Renaissance shift from the medieval elven lore, really. There was a lot more talk of elves in the medieval times, but pucks did exist, right? That then shifts around the Renaissance.
Well, so also that, I mean, when we're talking about those little turns of phrase which pop up again and again through, I said, the Renaissance literature and earlier stuff, like that stuff about slipping through keyholes that I mentioned earlier, or just the different ways they explain what it is that fairies do. Some of that is in this song that we heard just earlier.
Oh, really good. Yeah, I mean, so the song itself, The Fairies...
Mention Mabat, actually, as well.
It does mention Mab, yeah. Mm-hmm. The song itself is, I think, early 18th century.
Yes.
Could be earlier. So it's very much working in the tradition of that Renaissance that Renaissance style. But again, this is not... I made a conscious choice that we wouldn't go with the earliest lyrics. We would go with lyrics that had been folkified, that have been rewilded over the centuries, that have organically accrued through practice more folkloric fairy elements by just coming from the countless infinity of nameless performers who have contributed to this democratized version of the form. But now, I mean, they're not quite nameless, but now we can add Belinda Kempster and Fran Foote to this great chain of singing.
Yeah, they're really fantastic. They're a mother-daughter duo based in Essex, I believe.
Deeply rooted in Essex, I'd say. I mean, they are really, their entire approach to music and to folk culture is exactly the sort of thing that we love and agree with.
We speaking to them on the phone, they told us that they often specifically engage in with music from
stuff. Yeah,
from Essex.
Yeah. They're really good.
That's cool.
Good proper regional folklore, folk music. Their whole thing. So they're, as we said, they're a mother and daughter duo, which in itself is amazing. But they have this real family lineage of folk music, and a great project. So there's a long-term project is to record versions of all the music collected by a distant relative of theirs, who Belinda, the mother, sang with and was taught songs by. Ernie Austin, his name is. He was a great folk singer and recorder of folk songs in the I think, 60s, 70s, certainly. I love everything about this continuity that they are really conscious of and really committed to. This passing forward of the songs, a no frills thing as well. They really emphasize this no frills approach.
Yeah, they sing a cappella quite a lot.
They're really good. They've and obviously this comes from working closely with someone artistically, creatively over a long period, but they are able to produce such phenomenal and fairly instinctual harmonies. Like they produced this music so quickly, the turnaround was so short. They did such a good job. I mean, it's really hard stuff to get a song, an old song like that with this older tune, an older style of tune, no accompaniment, and to make it as engaging and beautiful as they did.
It sounds very fresh. I think that recording.
I really love it. Yeah. As you say, we very much hope to get more from them, and fingers crossed we'll have some music from them in our Christmas special, which you've got to look forward to in December.
Before we finish, I want to hear this week's recipe.
Oh, this do you indeed? Recipe. Well, yes. I'd actually completely forgotten.
I'm getting hungry.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this. As anyone who is new to finding folklore, as of this episode, may not know, we conclude each episode with just as the song itself was related to the tale, and all the chat you've just suffered through is related to both and to the wider folk tradition. What we will now enjoy is a historic English recipe for something which is again related to to everything we've been discussing. So what I've got here is something called fairy butter.
Lovely.
Fairy butter.
I just wanted to add that I think a little bit of the feedback that we've had since the first episode went out is that this section is sort of surprising and off-putting.
This section is so weird,
and that's why we're going to lean into it.
I'm not going to stop making these weird recipes. What we generally do is I find some weird English recipe that is related to this whole folk thing, and then I go and make it, and we try it out.
The last one was a great success. So
it was lovely. This one,
keep doing it.
This one is more of a sort of an amuse-bouche or a little snack, kind of like it's a sort of a spread you could put on Melba toast. Take the yolks of 2 hard eggs in a mortar with a large spoonful of orange flower water and 2 teaspoonfuls of fine sugar beat to a powder. Then beat all together till it is a fine paste. Then mix it up with about as much fresh butter out of the churn and force it all through a fine strainer full of little holes into a plate. This is a pretty thing to set off a table at supper. So essentially, you're taking egg yolks, and hard-boiled eggs, right? Yeah. Hard-boiled eggs. Remove the hard-boiled egg yolks.
Right.
You are then crushing them in with orange flower water, orange water, or you can use rose water. I've seen other recipes use rose water. Essentially, some floral water.
Orange blossom water.
Orange blossom water would be nicer, I think, than rose water. I really like that kind of slightly. It's a bit too floral, the taste of rose water is for me.
It doesn't strike me as the right thing for this.
No, but tastes vary. But yeah, orange blossom water is also fine. So you're mashing the yolks up with orange blossom water and sugar, essentially. Yeah. And then you kind of make that about 50-50 fresh butter. Straight out of the churn. Now, I've not churned enough butter to know what the distinction is between fresh butter straight out of the churn and older butter. Maybe it just has to have a chance to set. Perhaps that's it. I don't know. Yeah. But whatever. So it's about 50-50 soft butter, 50-50 with this floury, sugary egg yolk thing. And then it's pushed through a sieve, specifically so that it then becomes kind of weird tendrils. And it's the reason it's called is because fairy butter is also the name of a type of mushroom. And so I think that when you push it like that, it's supposed to...
It comes out looking like the mushroom.
It's supposed to come out looking at these tiny, long, tall mushrooms all clustered together.
Yeah.
So if you then do that onto like some Melba toast or something, or an oat cake or some such, then you could also garnish it with a few other little flowers around. And you've got this funny looking thing, which you then take and smear as a spread of any sort. It sounds rather jolly.
I'd eat it.
And it's quite interesting, actually, that it's called fairy butter. This is an 18th century recipe, by the way.
I was going to ask about the
name. That particular reading was from The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy. But it's a good old weird English confection, and I think it's very interesting that it's combining egg with flowers. It's and sugar. So it's taking the natural world and then it's splicing it with this floral thing. That's interesting because the flower fairy thing, fairies' deep association with flowers in particular, really didn't become very hard established until a bit later than this recipe. So I see this recipe as very much part of that process whereby that trope, that motif, if you will, is cohered as being part of and typifying the fairies, which is what you get in the 19th century with flower fairies in particular.
Yeah.
This idea that fairies are so related to flowers. Eggs also, we often see fairies being related to birth somehow. This fairy midwife thing is a great example of that. But also we see in A Midsummer Night's Dream, this idea of them taking a child, changeling children. They're often taking babies. We see that across the lore. I kind of like all of that together, and the weird, almost otherworldly sweetness of sugar seems so appropriate for the lure of the hedonism and the indulgence of fairyland. So I really like that this recipe for fairy butter, it's just such a simple little decorative spread, but it so perfectly combines all the elements.
Yeah, I would say like the story that we heard, like the music that we heard, it is simple and sweet.
And not unlike the people who you heard it from, I would say. If you're happy with that, then so am I. And I think I will read us out.
Please take us out on...
Well, just for else, I would like to say thank you to everyone for listening thus far. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I've really enjoyed this episode.
Me too.
Next,
let us know what you think.
Yeah, do all the things.
Comment and, like, subscribe.
And if you've seen fairies of any stripe, let us know, please. I would love to receive more stories, more personal accounts, more fragments of lore that you heard growing up, or that are part of your lived experience. Please do. If not, and in the interim, you can look forward to the deep dive video of this coming out soon after, probably about a week after. And then episode 3 of Sheaf and Shield.
Oh, it's a great story.
That's a very different story again. We talked about this diversity and breadth of the English folktale tradition. And the next one, again, totally different from this one and the last one.
I find it quite a surprising story. I really enjoy Sheaf and Shield.
It's mythic, esoteric. But before there, I have to read you out. And I will do so with an excerpt from Songs of the Pixies by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Hence thou lingerer light, eve saddens into night. Mother of wildly working dreams, we view the sombre hours that round thee stand with downcast eyes, a duteous band, their dark robes dripping with the heavy dew. Sorceress of the ebon throne, thy power the pixies own, when round thy raven brow heaven's lucent roses glow, and clouds in watery colours dressed float in light drapery o'er thy sable vest. What time the pale moon sheds a softer day, mellowing the woods beneath its pensive beam, for mid the quivering light 'tis ours to play, I dancing to the cadence of the stream. Welcome, ladies, to the cell where the blameless pixies dwell.
This was Finding Folklore with Brice Stratford and James Carney. The song The Fairies was performed by Belinda Kempster and Fran Foote. The theme music was composed by Su Eaton. Join us next time in Finding Folklore.